Right, I think we'll make a start there. Welcome everyone to the 6th seminar of the Contemporary Women's Writing and the Medical Humanities online seminar series, organised with the support of the Centre for Contemporary Women's Writing and the Institute of Modern Languages Research in London. So just to say that we're going to be using audio description and live captioning from now on. So if everyone sees at the bottom of their screen on Zoom, there should be a little button that says live transcript with CC above it. So if everyone puts that on, and then you can also alter the settings of the subtitles. So hopefully that works for everyone. Let us know in the chat if it isn't working for any reason, and we've got a few plan Bs, so we can put those into effect. So I'll just introduce the seminar series. This online seminar series for postgraduates and early career researchers seeks to explore how contemporary women's writing in particular, be this fiction, poetry, autobiographical, or philosophical writing, is currently engaging with issues such as illness, disease, healthcare, medical practice, and clinical institutions. There are a wide range of themes being covered, and we are accepting ongoing abstracts, so please feel free to get in touch with me and Becky if you have any ideas for future seminars. I should also mention that we're also organising an international conference for July 2021, so we'll give you more details of that at the end, and you can also apply for that. We started in September of this year, and we are continuing until March 2021 with fortnightly seminars, always on Tuesday evenings at 5:30 p.m. until 7 p.m. UK time. Tonight, as we have 4 speakers, the session will probably go on until about 7:30. So you can register for the seminars via the IMLR, and we'll put the link in the chat for the upcoming seminars. So before we begin, a few Zoom house rules. This session is being recorded so that it can be uploaded to the IMLR website and to YouTube afterwards. So please feel free to turn off your cameras or to leave them on, whichever you feel more comfortable with. We will be having the 4 15-minute papers and then a Q&A session at the end. If you could all remain on mute during this Q&A session and during the papers, this would be very much appreciated. During the Q&A, if you would like to ask a question, please feel free to use the raise hand option on Zoom, and then we'll ask you to unmute. The raise hand icon is found through clicking participants and then your own name, where there's an option to raise hand in the options. You might also want to type the word question into the chat box so that we can come to you next. If you're not comfortable with voicing your own question, please write them in the chat box function at the bottom of the Zoom bar so we can read out your questions to the speakers. Please feel free to add your questions to the chat as we're listening to the papers, or you can save them for afterwards. So yeah, as I said before, we'll now be providing audio description and captioning for the seminars. In a minute, we'll pass over to our guest chair for this evening, Professor Hannah Thompson, who will introduce how this will happen in a bit more detail. First, however, I'll pass over to Becky, who will introduce the topic of this week's seminar and this week's guest chair, Professor Hannah Thompson.
Hey, yeah, thanks everybody for coming this evening. It's great to see so many people. So I'm going to introduce our guest moderator for this week. So we're running it a little bit differently this week. So Hannah Thompson is Professor of French and Critical Disability Studies at Royal Holloway, University of London. She has published widely on 19th century French prose fiction, with particular reference to gender, sexuality, and the non-normative body. Her book, Naturalism Redressed, Identity and Clothing in the Novels of Émile Zola, published by Legenda in 2004, Taboo, Corporeal Secrets in 19th century France, published by Legenda in 2013. Her third monograph, Reviewing Blindness in French Fiction, published by Palgrave in 2017, marked the beginning of a new research focus on the intersections between critical disability studies and French studies. Hannah is currently working on creative audio description in museums, art galleries and theatres, and the notion of blindness gain. She is the author of the popular blogspot, popular blog Blindspot, apologies, and I'll link that in the chat in a minute. And you can follow her on Twitter at Blindspot Hannah, and again, I'll link the Twitter handle in the chat. And we brought Hannah on board to moderate this this week, because we are having a disability studies focus for this week's panel with 4 brilliant wide-ranging papers. So I'll hand over to Hannah now, who will do a bit more introducing.
Thanks, Becky. Thanks, Ben. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me. So as Becky said, I work on audio description, and I've found that Zoom is not necessarily a very blind-friendly place. So what I have started doing is describing myself and asking people to describe themselves. So we're not going to ask everyone to describe themselves, because that would take probably about as long as we've got. I'll start though. So I would describe myself. Oh, and the other thing is that I've been doing a project called Describing Diversity, which is about how important it is that people know whether or not there's someone like them, or someone who looks like them, or kind of represents them. And quite often, audio describers feel a bit awkward about describing diverse characteristics. So I'm trying to get people to think more about that. So I'm a partially blind, middle-aged woman with greying, darkish blonde hair in a ponytail, big purple glasses, and eyes that look like cat's eyes. And I'm looking quite tired and drawn at the moment. It's getting towards the end of term. Okay, so before I introduce the speakers, perhaps Ben and Becky would like to do a quick description as well. Ben, do you want to go first?
Yeah, so I'm a 29-year-old white man with brown hair and a big brown beard and a nose piercing, and I'm wearing a green checked shirt.
Thank you.
I'm also a 29-year-old person, 29-year-old woman, white. I have kind of gold sort of 70s porn star aviator glasses on, and my hair is sort of fake blonde-ish in a bun. And I also look very drawn this evening, so I joined the club, Hannah.
Can I just say you're also young? It makes me feel a little bit, yeah.
I'm still young.
So the other thing I was going to say is that for political and practical reasons, I like to keep my camera off. So I'm going to switch it off in a minute. Politically, this is just to remind people that you don't need to see someone in order to appreciate their brilliant comments. So I don't mind if anyone has their cameras on or off. I can't really tell anyway, so I'm completely okay with whatever works for everyone. Practically, it just means I have to get very close to the screen, which means you get a lovely view of my hairline, which no one wants that. So I'm going to switch my camera off in a minute. In fact, I'm going to switch my camera off now so that I can read my screen to you, and I'm going to introduce the first speaker. So first, we're going to do all 4 talks, and then we'll have some discussion and comments. But I'll introduce the speakers as it comes up to their turn. So we're going to start with Sarah Simpson from the University of Edinburgh, and she's going to speak on intellectual disability and undertones of eugenics in Amparo Davilas Oscar. Sorry for the terrible Spanish accent. So Sarah has recently completed a master's by research in Hispanic Studies at the University of Edinburgh. She graduated with a BA in Spanish from Oxford University in 2018. Her research focuses on Latin American short stories, especially by women authors, often touching on the fantastic and adjacent genres. And this paper is adapted from her master's dissertation, examining the portrayal of intellectual disability in 3 short stories. Brilliant. Welcome, Sarah. Over to you.
Thanks very much, Hannah. Yeah, I'll describe myself. I'm a white 23-year-old woman with blonde hair. I have a little pink in it, but you can't really tell on Zoom, I think. And I'm wearing a grey jumper. Okay, I'm just gonna share my screen. Okay. Amparo Davila was born in 1928 in the Mexican state of Zacatecas. I have a picture of her on screen as a young woman wearing a lot of eyeliner and holding a cat. She died earlier this year in April 2020, aged 92. After publishing 3 collections of poetry in the 1950s, Davila went on to write 3 books of short stories between 1959 and 1977. She's best known for this short fiction. All of her short stories were republished by the Fondo de Cultura Económica in 1 volume in 2008, alongside several previously unpublished stories. Davila's work has often been categorized within the genre of the fantastic, although the author herself disputed this classification. In this paper, I'll focus on the short story Oscar from Davila's 3rd collection, Árboles Petrificados, Petrified Trees, published in 1977, for which she won the prestigious Javier Villarrutia Award. Oscar takes place in an unnamed rural village. References are made to a similarly nameless city, only ever referred to as La Capital. It's not made explicit whether this refers to a national or a state capital. The setting and time is equally unclear. There's no dates to anchor it in a particular time period, and nor do the events nor technologies depicted really give many clues. This lack of specifics contributes to the atmosphere of ambiguity of the story in general. The text focuses on the Roman family, comprising a mother, father, and what the reader assumes to be their 4 adult children. Monica, Cristina, and Carlos are referred to directly as sons and daughters, while Oscar is never confirmed to be the parent's son, but it seems his most likely relationship with the family. Although it's never stated, Oscar appears to have some kind of intellectual disability. He's apparently nonverbal, never speaking in a way that the other characters can understand. He displays an obsessive insistence on routine, becoming agitated whenever anything in the house deviates from this. The other characters are reluctant even to mention him, confining him to the basement of the house and always treating him with fear and contempt. The family's rejection of Oscar, sadly, is far from unusual. Intellectual disability has often been characterized as a mark of otherness or undesirability, and this same tendency was apparent in post-revolutionary Mexico. In this paper, I'll explore how the text is influenced by the nationalist eugenicist ideas that were prevalent in the early 20th century in Mexico. Historical background. So Mexico experienced an identity crisis as a young nation. Popular belief dictated that homogeneous population was key to a country's shared purpose and culture. As Nancy Leigh Steppen points out, centuries of colonialism, racial mixture, and immigration from all over the world had left Latin American countries with a racial makeup that differed wildly from this conception of unity. In the case of Mexico, this crisis gained a great deal of traction following the revolution. Once the armed phase of the revolution ended in 1917, the country began to turn to an explicitly eugenicist ideology, concerned with improving the nation's stock, as it were. So-called mental normality was one of the chief concerns of eugenicists from the beginning. In 1921, the Primer Congreso Mexicano del Niño, the first Mexican conference on the child, cited childhood abnormality as a problem in need of immediate resolution. In 1932, the state of Veracruz sanctioned Mexico's only eugenic sterilization law, which included provisions for the legal sterilization of, this is some ableist language here, idiotas, which translates as idiots. Although there is scant evidence that sterilizations were actually carried out, the selection criteria for sterilization serves as a reflection of the characteristics that were deemed undesirable in Mexico at the time. The forefront of the Mexican eugenicist movement was Dr. Alfredo Saavedra. Saavedra founded the Sociedad Mexicana de Eugenesia, Mexican Society of Eugenics, in 1931. His main focus was the domain of the family. A strong desire to restructure the nation's genetics manifested in an interest in controlling motherhood and children. Saavedra was by no means unique in this. Mexican eugenicists became obsessed with distinguishing so-called normal children from abnormal ones. Emphasis was placed on the utility of intelligence tests to determine the level of a child's intellectual ability. By the 1930s, between 90,000 and 200,000 students were being tested every year by the Departamento de Pedagogía y Higiene, the Department of Psychopedagogy and Hygiene. Dr. Roberto Solis Quiroga, director of the pedagogical, sorry, I forgot to translate the institute names, the Medical Pedagogical Institute, pushed for the creation of an institute for children with intellectual disabilities, whom he considered a threat to society because of their defective heredity. That's a quote from him. Separating such individuals from normal society was considered paramount. Although overt support for eugenics began to wane after the 1940s, its influence was still felt for decades. Prominent eugenicists like Saavedra and Solis Quiroga continued to participate in activities organized by the Mexican Academy of Penal Sciences and to collaborate with its journal Criminalia up until the end of the 1960s. While eugenics was no longer, therefore, the prevalent ideology by the time Oscar was written, it had certainly left its mark on the national psyche. In Davila's text, the Roman family represents a model 20th century Mexican family. This is, however, marred by the presence of Oscar. We see the contrast between Oscar and the other family members in the following excerpt. Which is on the screen. You could say that the Roman family was one of the most well-off in town. They had a large house of their own, a notary office, and a son who was a school teacher. Nevertheless, the money that father and son earned barely covered their household expenses. That is, the many expenses incurred by Oscar. Their large house is reflective of the family's middle-class status in relation to their immediate environment of the village, as are the respected careers of the male members of the family who perform the breadwinning role associated with their gender. This is contrasted with Oscar, who is unable to carry out paid work, which represents a violation of Foucault's work imperative. Oscar's inability to work means that he is not considered a productive member of his family, nor of wider society. Not only does Oscar fail to add money to the family, in fact, he subtracts it by incurring further costs, as this quotation demonstrates. That's how they feel about him. The text, therefore, sets up this ideal Mexican family as being encumbered by their intellectually disabled relative, exactly the scenario feared by eugenicists like Saavedra. As well as the financial costs linked to Oscar's condition, there are physical and emotional repercussions for the other family members. Monica notes an extreme decline in her mother's health, implied to be the result of living with and caring for Oscar. The father's death is directly attributed to a physical struggle with Oscar, and the mother's death is strongly implied to be linked to her husband's, as she falls very ill only a week later and dies soon afterwards. The narrator thus attributes the death of these supposedly sane characters to the strain that Oscar exerts on the family. Furthermore, Oscar is cast as standing in the way of the family's chances of progress. The text sets up a stark dichotomy between rural backwardness and urban modernity. At the beginning of the text, the Roman's daughter, Monica, returns to the village from the city where she has lived for some time. There's a certain parallel with the writer's own life. As a young woman, Davila moved from the provincial town of Pinos, Zacatecas to Mexico City against the wishes of her father and found the freedom to pursue her writing career that provincial life hadn't allowed her. In the text, Monica represents the modernizing force of the city. While living there, she has become more sophisticated and fashionable, presenting a clear contrast with the village which remains unchanged, a fact repeatedly emphasized by the narrator. Oscar is portrayed as the ultimate force keeping them in stasis. Like the village, his condition never improves, and his reticence to any kind of change is seen as being reflective of this stagnation. He is supposedly the reason that the family must stay in their old-fashioned rural home rather than leaving in favor of a modern urban setting. This casting of Oscar as an obstruction in the path of modernity is particularly reminiscent of the attitudes to intellectual disabilities that we've seen in Mexico following the revolution. Oscar, supposedly a physical and financial burden on an otherwise seemingly ideal Mexican family, according to Mexican eugenicists, keeps them from progressing in the same way that those eugenicists believe that people like him held back Mexican society at large. This becomes ever more apparent when the family home goes up in flames and the other family members leave Oscar presumably to perish in the fire. The fire acts as a so-called cleansing element, finally ridding the family of the burden that they feel Oscar represents to them. The three siblings, this is a quote, set off walking hand in hand toward the road heading out of town, leading out of town. Not one of them turned their head to take one last look at the burning house. This act of not looking back has a double significance. Firstly, it demonstrates the family members' resolution to turn a blind eye to Oscar's fate. And secondly, it reflects an emphasis on moving forwards, which they will be able to do now that the force that they have always attributed with dragging them back has been removed. The fact that the siblings make their way towards the exit of the village implies that they are taking this opportunity to leave their entire way of life behind. Without Oscar and the prison of their ancestral home to restrict them, the three siblings feel that they will be able to progress and participate in modern, civilized society. When Oscar is removed as the result of a fire with ambiguous origins, the siblings are conveniently exculpated from blame, aim to reap the benefits of the death of this other in their midst without actively engaging in the practice of eugenic murder. As we've seen, intellectually disabled people were seen as a threat to so-called normal society in 20th century Mexico, as in many other places influenced by eugenicist ideology, particularly at that time. The casting of Oscar as a similar impediment to the model Roman family sets up a scaled-down version of the same dynamic. Thus, the family acts as a microcosm of a eugenicist nation, which succeeds in expelling the supposedly dangerous element believed to impede its progress. It's very difficult to determine the authorial intent behind the story. It's far from clear whether Davila intends to condemn the family's behavior or to present them as sympathetic. It seems very possible that the eugenic undertones of the story were unintentional, and that Davila meant to write a story of a family escaping from physical and psychological entrapment. The fact that she used the language of intellectual disability to create the adversary is, however, telling. As I've shown, it reflects the ways in which intellectual disability has been constructed as a detrimental other and threatening to normal society. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. That was absolutely fascinating, quite depressing.
Yeah.
I kept waiting for the bit where you went, however.
Sorry.
We can come back to that. That's fine.
We can stop sharing.
I think at the top there's a red thing that says yeah. That's the extent of my Zoom knowledge, guys, by the way. And I only found that out today. I had a Zoom tutorial earlier for a different project. Okay, so so if you've got questions, you can pop them in the chat or save them up. And we're going to move straight on to Katja Herges. Is that right? Or Herges?
Yes. Herges.
Sorry, I meant to check with you.
That's fine.
So from the Department of Psychosomatic Medicine at the University of Tübingen, who's going to talk to us about affect, politics and gender in women's life writing about ALS and dying. So Katja is a physician and a literary scholar in the Department of Psychosomatic Medicine and Psychotherapy at the University of Tübingen in Germany. She earned her MD from the University of Heidelberg and her PhD in German Studies from the University of California at Davis, with a designated emphasis in feminist theory and research. So a fascinating trajectory. Her academic interests include critical medical humanities, feminist theory, German and American cultural studies, migration studies and mental health. And she is writing a book entitled Becoming Ill, Chronic Illness and Materiality in Visual Life Narratives in Contemporary Germany. And this work analyzes how life writing reconceptualizes medical and cultural understandings of chronic illness. And her work has been published in Humanities, Medical Humanities and Women, and Gender and Research. Brilliant. Katja, this is great. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Hannah. So I start with the audio description. So I'm a white woman in my late 30s. I've blondish hair down to my shoulders, and I wear small glasses, and today I'm also wearing a green cardigan. So I'm first going to share my screen. Oh. Okay, I hope everybody can see the slides.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Great. Okay. All right. Okay, that works. So I'm starting to read. So in the last decades, illness narratives have been published in increasing numbers in Germany and in other Western countries. Patients, family members, or even healthcare providers write about their experiences of illness in memoirs, diaries, letters, or fiction. Autothanatographies, so-called memoirs about the narrator's own looming death, have developed as a particular subgenre. For instance, US neurosurgeon Paul Kalanithis, When Breath Becomes Air, and French philosopher Rouven Anciens, Mémile et une nuit, have received significant attention in media and scholarship. In addition to such traditional illness narratives, more recently, blogs, websites, Facebook posts, or Instagram images have emerged as new forms of life writing about illness. For instance, in Germany, East Berlin writer Wolfgang Herrndorf wrote a blog entitled Arbeit und Struktur, in English as Work and Structure, after his diagnosis of brain cancer, and this blog has been published as a popular memoir after his suicide in 2013. Such publications by established writers about experiences with cancer have been well received in public media in Germany or elsewhere. In contrast, memoirs by so-called nobodies, including many women, narratives about illness experiences other than cancer, and also digital projects have until recently been less mediatized and analyzed in Germany. So while traditional news outlets marginalize nobody memoirs, social media create spaces for people diagnosed with terminal illness to tell their stories, which makes them venues for the exchange of health-related information, advice, and support. Interesting research has shown that women participate more on social networking sites about health. Blogs have been adopted by individuals experiencing serious illness as a way of documenting and sharing experiences, exploring treatment options, and connecting with others who have knowledge or experience with the illness. So to draw attention to such writing, my presentation today will focus on relational or collaborative online and print narratives by two young German women with the neurological disease amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, or known as ALS. As you may know, ALS leads to progressive loss of a person's mobility due to an increasing paralysis of most muscles of the body. It usually leads to an early death, mostly within a few years. In the following, I explore the affective aesthetics and politics of these relational and hybrid narratives. I thereby draw on Lauren Berlant's notion of intimate public sphere, which is political foremost as an affective world of conventional social belonging, but also as a space for political change. I argue that these narratives create an intimate network of caring connections that expands our understanding of illness beyond the individual as relational, affective, and social. So the first woman I'm talking about is Sandra Schadek. She was a student of economics and started to write a private diary about her diagnosis of ALS in 1999. Soon after her diagnosis, she has difficulties eating, walking, going to the bathroom, speaking, and sharing intimacy with her boyfriend, and feels like a prisoner in her own body. She uses her diary to structure and communicate her thoughts and feelings about this process of social exclusion and isolation that she experiences. Later, she develops a public website and edits and revises her notes, and also adds text by her carers, friends, and family members on the website. So there are about 300 patients, relatives, friends, and colleagues, physicians, nurses, therapists, hospice workers, and psychologists that contact her through the website and also through emails and guest book posts and letters. Later on, she even develops an app for her network to keep everybody informed. Eventually, she also rewrote her blog and published it as a book in 2009, entitled Ich bin eine Insel gefangen in meinem Körper, which translates as I am an island imprisoned in my own body. And Schadek died in January 2015. So like Schadek, Nina Zacher, she starts to also write after her diagnosis of ALS in order to reflect what it means to lose her motor abilities and to have a very limited time to live. At the moment of her diagnosis, Zacher was a married mother of 4 children in her 40s and runs a well-known restaurant in Munich together with her husband. At the beginning, she writes to herself and emails her diary notes to her husband, but soon she publishes these long reflective posts about her life and death on Facebook, first to her friends and then publicly for an audience of up to 30,000 followers. Later, she's invited to talk shows and publishes love letters to her husband in local newspapers. After her death in 2016, her husband publishes her writings in a collaborative memoir with the title Such dir einen schönen Stern am Himmel, which translates as Look for a beautiful star on the sky. And she had already before her death, she had contacted a ghostwriter, Dorothea Seitz, to help writing the memoir. Her husband also founded a non-profit organization in Munich after her death that strives to improve diagnosis and treatment of ALS. So this sort of shift of genre and media that they go through, this is also impacted by their embodied disabilities. So I think it's also interesting to talk about how the books have been written. So while Schadek is working on her website and her book, her ability to sit and write and type decreases, and she uses a screen keyboard, which we see on the slide, to write. For Zacher, she initially dictates her thoughts, but soon she experiences difficulties breathing and loses her ability to speak. And so she continues to write until her a few days before her death with an eye-controlled computer system, which basically takes her a few hours to finish a few sentences. So now I'm looking more at the language of the texts and the intimate connections that are formed through an intimate language. So before the illness, Schadek reflects how she never dared to talk openly about her feelings and opinions out of fear not to please. However, writing about her experience of loneliness and isolation serves as a kind of therapy that empowers her to communicate thoughts and feelings with family and friends and to create an intimate community of support. So she writes, so these are my translations. The certainty not to be alone with one's problems can be of help in the daily fight and eases a lot of things. Furthermore, I've made many beautiful memories through my website. I found people that I had lost out of sight for many years. And at the same time, I have been surprised by the empathy, helpfulness, and support of complete strangers. Some people with the disease wrote me that they felt like me, that they had the same problems, thoughts, and fears, and that I would speak from the bottom of their heart. I had tears in my eyes out of joy since I was hoping so much to accomplish this by dealing openly with the disease, and maybe even by speaking out things that might be hard to express for many people with the disease. But I also received a lot of encouragement by family members who were grateful to learn how somebody with the disease feels like. Similarly, in response to her Facebook posts, also Sacher receives messages and emails and letters that express interest, confirmation and support, and even admiration in light of her honesty, and that encouraged her to write further. So she also finds this intimate community online in which she feels no longer alone. I also have a quote from her. Facebook friends are not as bad as their reputation. Quite in contrast, they are incredible people with whom I have been friends for many years and who I would have lost without social media because they are scattered all around the world. Many write incredibly caring things which might not come less easy to them in direct contact. Total strangers open their heart to me and tell me most personal things in order to give me strength and sympathies. So these affective and the described affective and intimate nature of their connections translates into their writing styles. So both develop sort of sentimental language of the heart that expresses a wide range of emotions like joy, empathy, gratefulness, fear, sadness, desperation, also through the use of smiley faces and Facebook status updates. And I've marked some of these, this kind of language in the two quotes. So like total strangers open their heart to me. And Schadek explains the style on her blog. Okay, so she says, of course, I could have told the course of my illness in my narrative soberly and factually, but that would have not done justice to life with this disease. To have ALS means so much loss, goodbye, letting go, acceptance, patience, and resignation. It makes me helpless and dependent, sad, and it doesn't make sense to gloss over ALS and the resulting problems. That is why I have attempted to write most openly and honestly about myself, my thoughts and feelings, but at the same time, to show that it is possible to have fun and to enjoy life nevertheless. So while such effective aesthetics and connections allow the formation of an intimate community of care, philosopher Lauren Berlant also points at the fantasy of belonging and commonality that might be inherent in such communities. Berlant argues that such primarily woman-produced and woman-consumed text, from the sentimental to the melodramatic, function to create an elaborate imaginary of intimacy that assumes women share a bond of communal longing in a women's culture. So she calls this a space intimate public sphere. In her book, The Female Complaint, Berlant explains the term. So what makes a public sphere intimate is an expectation that its consumer participants are marked by a commonly lived history. Its narratives and things are deemed expressive of that history, while also shaping its conventions of belonging and expressing the sensational, embodied experience of living as a certain kind of being in the world. It promises also to provide a better experience of social belonging. So from a theoretical standpoint, an intimate public is a space of mediation in which the personal is refracted through the general. What's salient for its consumers is that it is a place of recognition and reflection. In an intimate public sphere, emotional contact of a sort is made. This means that intimate publics thrive off a shared central wish of being able to transcend one's particular situation and to join a generalizable community through emotional connection. Further, Berlant argues here that the intimate public sphere works through a fantasy that one can change the political by transcending politics. It is affect or the supposed universalized features of the heart that offers a way of being that is outside of political. Yet the intimate public sphere also stays in deep relation to the political in a conventional way. Indeed, as I have shown, Zacher's and Schadek's projects aim at creating an effective and intimate belonging within a like-minded community of sufferers, mediated by an effective language of support that provides a relief from the world of illness and dying. However, this created intimate space becomes at times also a heteronormative space that idealizes a particular way of living, caring, and dying. For instance, Zacher's focus on motherhood and family life in her stylized photographs seems to construct a fantasy of how to live a good life and to sentimentalize the death of a beautiful mother. Taking up his wife's daycare and night on his own, her husband connects marriage with the obligation for individual heroic practices of care that might overwhelm most people financially and emotionally. So he says, "For me as a husband with whom you share the most intimate and heartfelt in life, it was part of the fulfillment of my wedding vows." The project further focuses politically on the demand for increased medical research and the so-called fight against the disease, and hereby reinserts the conventional militarized discourse of cure or victory. Overall, the projects do rarely directly engage with structural inequalities, for instance, unequal access to services such as palliative care, matters that are not a priority for the middle class authors of these texts. Even so, Berlant reassures that a disappointing conventionality at the heart of such female complaint implies a potentiality for imagining a collective subjectivity. Media scholars Tamara Niese and Mera Besa draw on Berlant to describe how intimate publics emerge in digital writing about illness. So, quote, "Complex, intimate publics arise through encounters between patients and caregivers, among networks of mourners, and through subjects who trade paradigm for how best to live on considering." In their analysis of cancer blogs, Anthony McCosker and Raya Darcy find two aspects fundamental of these blogs: the production and management of affect through the repeated expression of experiences of illness, and the connectivity based on this affective labor. In other words, quote, "their value can be identified as personal in the form of identity management through a traumatic, disrupted life period, network enabling and generating online spaces for shared traumatic experience and a culture of self and networked help, and social and what is recubed in the form of non-institutional management of serious illness." Ultimately, according to McCosker, the authors of cancer blogs produce forms of shared public intimacy, which help to shape the broader social understanding of cancer, its experience, and personal affects. So drawing on these media scholars, I argue that Schadek's and Zacher's relational and collaborative website, blog, and memoir connect a network of human and non-human bodies, which include assistive devices, carers, families, to create and negotiate new subjectivities in an intimate public. Schadek's and her carers' texts and images engage with the ambivalences of care relationships that include fear of dependency, but also the formation of new friendships and helpful support. Similarly, Zacher's Facebook posts create intimate and caring connections and discussions between Nina, different carers, family members, that also go beyond idealizing the care relationship with her husband I was talking about. Rather, Zacher also engages critically with comments that she gets and opens up discussions on life-prolonging measures, which she refuses, and questions of accessibility. For instance, she critiques that people talk slowly to her, assuming that she also has a mental disability, that strangers touch her hair in public as if she was a child, and that friends mock her when she eats with assistants. Some admit that they learn to understand the illness due to her posts and want to change their behavior. So she comments, "I'm always surprised and knew that I can achieve much more with my story than I could have ever imagined. I like that people suddenly question and rethink their lives, priorities, and attitudes." So I'll summarize briefly. While the narratives of Schadek and Zacher create a normative and sentimental space of belonging and support in a fantasy of a common womanhood, at the same time, the project also allow multi-voiced and intimate public spheres of readers, responders, carers, and assisters devices to emerge. The relational narratives thereby create new modes of networked subjectivity that foster expression and management of affects and create communities of care. These non-institutional practices of care go beyond individual empowerment or the patient-physician encounter. In addition, taking such relational life writing by so-called nobodies seriously further expands the traditional genre of individualized illness narratives and highlights the relationality of the self. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Katja. That was absolutely fascinating. I really like your approach to critiquing the work as well as describing it. Thank you so much. I'm sure we're going to have some good questions and discussion. Okay, we're going to move straight on to Christina, whose talk is called Beautiful Lime, Mindful Crip Aesthetics and the Art of Being Sick. So Christina Lee is a fourth-year PhD student in the Department of English at King's College London. Her research focuses on interdisciplinary cross-cultural applications of the humanities in issues of health and illness. Her current research project, From Self-Cultivation to Self-Care, Cross-Cultural Biopolitics in Body-Mind Literature, looks at mindfulness memoirs by Buddhist women with chronic illnesses and examines how meditative practices transform their experience of illness and empower them in the process of active healing. She's co-founder of the KCL Disability Plus Intersectionality Reading Group and recently co-organized the Criposium, a two-day, excellent title by the way, a two-day online conference on intersectional disability. Brilliant. Thank you, Christina.
Okay, so can you see the screen, I think? Okay, so yeah, thank you to Hannah. I'm Christina. I am a 28-year-old Southeast Asian woman with black hair down to my neck, wearing a blue jumper, and I try not to lean too close to the camera so you don't see my dark bags under my eyes. So my paper is called Beautiful Lime, Mindful Aesthetics and the Art of Being Sick. Before I begin, I need to mention that this paper includes references to sex work, sexual abuse, trauma, depression, death, and grief. So if you need to leave at any time because it's triggering, please feel free to do so. So firstly, a bit about my research project. My thesis looks at mindfulness memoirs by Buddhist women with chronic illnesses, with a focus on their experiences of meditation and what it means to heal. Since the emergence of mindfulness-based therapies in the 1980s, research on mindfulness and health remains dominated by psychology and neuroscience, where the focus is on the cure and management of disease symptoms, and discourses of mindfulness are led by usually male clinical researchers like John Kabat-Zinn or famous religious leaders like the Dalai Lama, while women and patient voices, in particular female religious patient voices, are still being marginalized. In the medical humanities, despite the commercial popularity, there's still very little research in illness and life writing on non-mainstream mindfulness narratives like spiritual and popular self-help memoirs. So one of my objectives in my thesis is to show that non-mainstream mindfulness memoirs are a form of subjugated knowledge that is valuable to the medical humanities, and to find an alternative way of reframing mindfulness as an ethical practice that centers the ill person as a subject of care rather than object of cure. The book I'll be looking at today is called Mindfulness as Medicine, co-authored by Sister Dang Nhiem. His picture you see on the left, she's a Vietnamese-American woman in her 40s. She's smiling, wearing glasses, dressed in brown monastic robes. Sister Dang Nhiem was born in central Vietnam at the height of the Vietnam War in 1968. Her mother was a Vietnamese sex worker, and her father was thought to have been an American serviceman. When she was 9, she was sexually abused by her uncle, and when she was 12, her mother disappeared, presumed to have died. Despite speaking no English, Nam and her half-brother Sonny were sent to the United States under the American Immigration Act in 1982 for a better life and education. After leaving foster care at the age of 19, Nam studied at the San Francisco Medical School, training in family practice. And in 1999, her partner John died by drowning just before her 31st birthday. And overwhelmed by grief, she gave up her residency and moved to the Buddhist monastery Plum Village in France, where she undertook monastic training under the instruction of Vietnamese Zen master Thich Nhat Hanh. She was ordained as a bhikkhuni, a Buddhist nun, in the Plum Village tradition in the year 2000, and given the name Dang Nhem, Vietnamese for adornment with non-discrimination. In 2011, she contracted neural Lyme disease and was diagnosed with diabetes. Her first autobiographical memoir, Healing, shown in the picture on the right-hand side of the slide, with the red book cover and the white text that reads Healing, was published in 2010 and details her early life in Vietnam and the US and her early training as a Buddhist nun. Her second memoir, Mindfulness as Medicine, which I focus on today, was published in 2015 after she was diagnosed with chronic illnesses, and it's the book on the left-hand side with the painting of the blue sky and the green grass. In Mindfulness as Medicine, Dang Nhem writes that although she was trained in medicine, it was not her medical knowledge, but the practice of mindfulness that she learned at the monastery that taught her the art of being sick. So some of the questions I want to consider in this paper are: how do Buddhist nuns cope with this chronic illness and disability? How does Sister Dang Nhem use mindfulness to construct an art of being sick? And how does her practice of mindfulness reshape her perception and experience of beauty? As taught by the Buddha in his sermon on the Four Noble Truths, Buddhism understands suffering as distinct from pain. Suffering is denoted by the concept of the three marks of existence: dukkha, or disease, which refers to the physical and mental unpleasant sensations that arise from the experience of a painful event; anicca, meaning impermanence, which suggests that all things are subject to change and decay; and anatta, not self, the idea that there is no permanent essential self residing in the body, and that the idea of an individual self is itself a conditioned construct. While pain from sickness, aging, and death are a fact of the human condition and are inevitable, it is possible to end suffering by following the Buddha's ethical teachings and by practicing mindfulness to discern and remove the causes that generate suffering. The colloquial understanding of mindfulness is that it's a form of meditation that cultivates present moment awareness of one's thoughts, feelings, and bodily sensations through focus on the breath. In the Buddhist monastic context, mindfulness, however, is not just a technique for relieving stress, but an essential tool for spiritual cultivation and forms the foundation of an ethical style of living. The Order of Interbeing of the Plum Village tradition was founded by Thich Nhat Hanh in 1964 during the Vietnam War and was conceived as a spiritual resistance movement for healing the political, social, and ecological conflicts caused by war. Monastics of the order lead a frugal celibate lifestyle and follow the Vinaya, translated as monastic discipline, which contains detailed regulations about all aspects of monastic life, including how to dress monastic robes properly, how and what to eat, and how to behave towards other members. Monastics apply these precepts to guide their actions, but they are taught not to be caught up, such that they follow the rules uncritically. Outside of formal meditation sessions, the Plum Village tradition emphasizes mindfulness in daily living activities. Practitioners must be mindful in every moment of the day and everywhere, whether in the kitchen, bathroom, or traveling from one place to another. For example, when you hear the sound of the bell, you pause whatever action or activity you're doing and to observe your breath. This training of stopping with the sound of the bell teaches the monastics to be aware of their thoughts and feelings throughout the day, and to have more time to reflect on how their speech and action might impact on other people. When Nyam contracted Lyme disease, she found herself unable to keep up with fellow practitioners, both spatially during walking meditation practice and temporarily as her fatigue made it difficult for her to adhere to the monastic timetable and caused her to be late or absent from scheduled activities. Not only did she walk slower and took longer to arrive at places physically, it now took more time for her to organise and articulate her thoughts in language. She mispronounced words in English and in her native tongue Vietnamese, and easily forgot her train of thought, as her mind was, quote, simply in a state of drowsiness or blurriness. Alison Kafer describes this need for extra time to accommodate for illness or disability as crypt time. Living in crypt time meant being frequently out of sync with other people and moving at a different pace. But crypt time is not just about slower movements, but a complete reorientation to time. Margaret Price emphasizes that crypt time does not necessarily mean that time is slowed down, but can in some conditions, like psychosis, mean that time is accelerated to a terrifying cadence. In her creative non-fiction essay, 6 Ways of Looking at Crypt Time, Ellen Samuels describes crypt time as grief time, a time of mourning, the lost past healthy body, and lost loved ones, as pain increases both the yearning for human intimacy and awareness of the loved one's absence. As well as physical pain, Lyme disease also brought back vivid images and emotions which surged in Nyam's mind, quote, suddenly like a forest fire or flood, and brought back painful memories of past trauma. As a former physician, Nyam understood PTSD as a neurological disorder caused by emotional and physiological stress, but as a survivor of wartime trauma and sexual abuse, Nyam knew trauma viscerally as the uncontrollable physical trembling, the tightness in her chest, and as a full frontal assault on her life world. As she grieved for past losses and struggled with the new ones, the loss of the healthy body, the deterioration of mental acuity, and the loss of potential futures, she found herself alienated from her body, and she expresses this emotion of being disabled in mind and body as to being like an ugly apple tree. As I was walking away from the nunnery, I saw an apple tree that I had seen many times before. That morning it appeared as the ugliest tree I had ever seen in my life. It was so dry, barren, and perversely naked. The trunk was contorted, and its branches were like gross arthritic knuckles. It was horrible looking, and it was exactly how I was feeling about myself at that moment, in body and spirit. I was that tree right there in that moment. In Nyam's metaphorical self-portrait, the tree's arthritic knuckles mirrored her own inflamed joints, and its perverse nakedness expressed the physical and emotional vulnerability she felt at that moment. Her history of sexual abuse had instilled feelings of disgust towards her body, and the sudden onset of chronic illness and disability further added to a sense of self-shame. In Touching the Earth, Bell Hooks writes that when the body is regarded solely as a tool, such as in slavery, the mind and body experience a profound estrangement as the appearance of the body became more important than the body itself. Quote, it did not matter if the body was well, only that it appeared well. Post-industrial capitalist societies overemphasize bodily utility and efficiency, and as individuals become preoccupied with productivity, we become out of touch with our bodies as they are and forget how to be a body. In his mindfulness work, Thich Nhat Hanh contests this conventional logic of work and time by uncoupling time from productive labor and describing rest and the art of healing and the art of being lazy as an essential practice of mindful living and healing. Mindfulness of movement is politically potent because it foregrounds the disruption of cultural scripts by making individuals aware of social cultural conventions embedded in muscle memory and automatic reactions, and thus become open to acting otherwise. So in the chapter Joy, Nam recounts her experience of attending a Dharma talk where she had a severe bout of diarrhea, which caused intense stomach pains and muscle spasms. To cope with the pain, she had to walk very slowly and one breath at a time. And when she arrived at the hall, she kept her posture upright and relaxed to ease the spasm. Here, mindful walking and breathing not only helped her manage the pain, but also changed the way she experienced and used time. By recentering the flow of subjective body time, mindfulness normalized crip time as natural time and decolonized the body from the dominance of clock time. Incorporating laziness into the art of being sick in this way, Nam reclaimed time to work on the art of becoming herself rather than using her body to do work. As well as building concentration, mindfulness is also about cultivating wisdom and penetrating the truth of reality as conditioned by social conventions and assumptions. During meditation, Nam remembered that though barren and ugly in that moment, a few months ago before, the apple tree had had many leaves and bore many apples. Oh, sorry. Despite its appearance, the tree was in fact full of vitality and will flower again in the spring. The ugliness was not the quality of the tree itself, but of the negative emotions in her own mind that were projected onto the tree. The true cause of her grief and suffering was not the Lyme disease or even the tick that transmitted the bacteria to her, but the misconceived notions of a perfect, beautiful and healthy body that obscured the reality of the impermanence of the body. As the daughter of a sex worker growing up in a culture where the commodification of sex and female bodies was the norm, Nam was socially conditioned to perceive herself solely as an object of male desire and to measure her self-worth in terms of the economic capital her beauty brings. Turning her critical gaze away from her disabled body's misfitness and towards the notions of beauty and health themselves, Nam realized that her desires for health and beauty were really cravings for permanent existence, and it was this attachment to ideals that generated secondary suffering, i.e. disappointment in what the body should look like. At the Dharma talk, as she shuffled towards the hall slowly, her perspective horizons expanded and magnified her awareness of her surroundings, where she noticed that the soft sunlight and flowers growing along the sidewalk, and she realized that it was a beautiful day. Later, when she sat down, a member of the audience commented that she was so beautiful she could be a model. Mindfulness defamiliarized normative perceptions of the disabled body and encouraged her to experience beauty beyond representational aesthetics. Rescripting slowness as a deliberate, mindful style of moving rather than as a result of disability, then, gave her an aura of peace that was experienced by others as beautiful, and changed her way of looking at the world and enabled her to experience beauty in ordinary things and be beautiful even in the midst of pain. So some final thoughts. While I'm not advocating Buddhism as a solution to chronic illness or disability, I believe that these non-mainstream popular narratives deserve more attention than they currently receive. Memoirs like Mindfulness as Medicine show us that it is possible to experience illness and disability as spiritually, ethically, and aesthetically transformative experiences, rather than as medical tragedies. And as researchers in the medical humanities, it's important that we do listen and learn from these women's stories. And I'll end with a quote from Nam herself. "I don't see that I have left the field of medicine. To me, mindfulness is the most profound medicine that I can apply in my daily life to take care of myself, to transform and heal the suffering in myself, and thus it's the greatest medicine that I can offer to others, of all ages, regardless of religious and cultural backgrounds." Thank you.
Gosh, Christina, thank you so much. That was absolutely fascinating. Another really rich intervention, and I'm already seeing a lot of fascinating connections between what we've heard so far around issues of normativity and social convention and challenging mainstream notions of beauty, disability, etc. So we're gonna, there'll be lots of time to talk about all this after our final paper. So we're going to move on to Alice. Alice Hillswood is going to talk about autopathography as eco-biosocial resistance, Aurora Levins-Morales kindling. So Alice has a first-class MA degree from the University of Glasgow in English literature, and she was recently awarded a Wellcome Trust studentship to study an MA in Medical History and Humanities at the University of York in 2020-21. Her research interests span trauma studies, contemporary autopathographies, avant-garde literature, and eco-criticism. Brilliant. Thank you, Alice.
Thank you, Hannah. So I'm just going to share my screen.
You're going to do a quick audio description as well?
Yes, I will. Yeah, I'm a 23-year-old woman with brown hair and brown eyes and red lipstick. I'm wearing hoop earrings and a navy cord top. So I'm also going to audio describe my my presentation as well. But before I do that, I just want to thank Ben and Becky for organising the seminar series, and to Hannah for hosting tonight's event. It's also been wonderful hearing from Katya, Christina and Sarah, and also to see some familiar names in the audience. I also want to add a content warning because I do briefly reference sexual abuse. So the first slide has an image of the book Kindling, Writings on the Body by Aurora Levins-Morales. The book's front cover image is from a 19th century anatomical flip book, which shows an illustrated cross-section of a body from neck to hips. This slide also has the paper's title, my name, the University of York's logo, and the Wellcome Trust logo. The other slides in the presentation are dark grey, with a pale squiggly line across them, and quotes in white text that I'll incorporate while I'm speaking. The final two slides are dark grey with a full list of references in white text. So today I'll be talking about a radical autopathography called Kindling, Writings on the Body by Aurora Levins-Morales. This paper will demonstrate the extent to which autopathography can productively entangle inner worlds and outer landscapes in order to construct an alternative worldview, one that triumphs community healing. So Kindling is a hybrid, multimodal text which includes blog posts, diary entries, manifestos, short creative nonfiction, and poetry. The combination of which resists stasis and engages with not only the ill subject, but also matters of colonialism, anti-capitalism, ethnicity, and ecology. Linda Nash has suggested that American colonial infrastructures revealed that places could alter bodies as much as bodies could alter places. I argue that Levins-Morales' autopathography works to frame the osmotic exchanges between both. The formation of the body, which includes its fluid, integrative systems, functions not only as an extension of the environment, but also as its somatic reflection. Levins-Morales grounds her experience of environmental illness and the abuse she suffers at the hands of the American model of healthcare in a colonial history, a network of oppression. Born in Puerto Rico in 1954, she describes how the toxic landscape, awash with pesticides developed from nerve gases used in war, shaped her physiological future. She also talks about the extent to which her childhood experience of sexual abuse contributed to the weakening of her immune system, making her vulnerable to what she calls kindling. Although our first frame of reference for the word kindling might be the twigs that help start a fire, Levins-Morales defines kindling as the body reacting to small doses of many poisonous chemicals. Also known as multiple chemical sensitivity, Stacey Alimo has argued that environmental illness is a particularly 20th and 21st century phenomenon, in part because of the avalanche of xenobiotic chemicals produced and disseminated in recent years. Its emergence is inseparable from its historical context, which prioritized the modernization of agriculture and the exploitation of bodies for corporate gain. So Nash asserts that the imperative to explore and colonize new environments in the early 20th century led to various agricultural sanitation projects, which sought to render the environment passive. However, the ramifications of uncontained chemical abuse on the land and bodies of laborers caused a proliferation of new illnesses. Levins-Morales outlines her position clearly. She writes, "If I write about our bodies, I'm writing about the land and what has been done to it." So if we map the topographies of interdependent ontologies and materials, a desire for health and healing begins to transcend corporeal boundaries. A perspective turned inwards necessitates the value of looking outwards. Kindling offers a polyvocal enmeshment of concerns, of which none are denigrated to a hierarchy of significance. Levins-Morales constructs a mode of storytelling that embodies Alaimo's notion of transcorporeality, a perspective that emphasizes the interconnections, interchanges, and transits between human bodies and non-human natures. Her descriptive language breaks beyond the confines of allopathic, hypermedicalized terminology. She writes that she can't tell you what her body does when it has a grand mal tonic-clonic seizure, but she describes it as a lightning storm, waking up in the landscape of its aftermath, in a field of debris. This semantic reframing gestures to a lack of control she feels during a seizure, but also to the material residue of a human body in crisis. Levins-Morales' transcorporeal imagery has been read by Brenner Yu-Chen Tai as a strategy of decolonial epistemology that fosters radical co-presence. And this, of course, contributes a valuable lens for evaluating the epistemic reach of her text. And not only do her eco-critical metaphors redress the ill body in line with the politicized agenda, they also reveal the extent to which natural descriptors provide a safe way of exploring her own limits of embodiment. In an interview with Suzanne Bost in 2017, Levins-Morales asserted her desire to vacate her abused body through connecting with the natural world, feeling the ecological web extending out. And we can see this in Kindling. Her diction is charged with the energy of ecologies and conversation, implicating the human body and illness in wider environmental terrains. In her poem Transfusion, Levins-Morales equates human blood with the green, sweet sap no one can imagine in midwinter, which points to human bodies as material entities coexisting with organic matter. She implores, "Let the earthworms make soil out of dead leaves and broken limbs." The motif of decay exemplifies her awareness of sickness and death as processes entangled with the materiality of nature. More generally, her writing demonstrates the kind of narration that Rita Sharon argues is a pivotal strategy for reflecting a rich and earthy unity of body, mind, and life. The erosion of body-earth boundaries is central to Kindling's polemical style and vision for healing. A further meshing of body and earth is alluded to in Levins-Morales' poem Exoskeleton, which delicately reimagines a wheelchair as a structure that forms part of her body, but is also something that she can leave behind. She writes, "The chair speaks for me, a new and less exhausting form of speech. It's the shiny carapace that lets the world know my species." Julia Watts-Belzer has suggested that disability brings people into intimate relations with material things, and that it's this intimacy that lends these material things animacy. She argues that the relationship between wheelchair users and their wheelchairs challenges the normative dichotomy that separates inert matter from vibrant life. By conferring such agency to her wheelchair, Levins-Morales amplifies the interdependence of humans and the matter that surrounds them. The nouns carapace and species disintegrate anthropocentric boundaries by pronouncing an inherent animality in all things. Again, her language gestures to transcorporeality. Alaimo suggests in the Posthuman Glossary that the human subject is reckoning with the strange agencies that interconnect substance, flesh, and place. In a similar vein, Levins-Morales appears to adopt a kaleidoscopic vision through which readers can locate themselves within a multi-layered, intermeshed existence. Her poesis generates a lexical platform that brings together sick and healthy bodies and human and non-human entities. Imagining her wheelchair as an exoskeleton also enables Levins-Morales to express the emotional significance of separating from it without casting it as an obstacle in the way of authentic freedom. For Levins-Morales, freedom is obtained not through walking, but through integrated resistance to oppressive systems. I side with Lena Wangren, who has argued that health is more fruitfully understood through the lens of intersectionality. Following an intensive treatment at an alternative health facility in Cuba, Levins-Morales demonstrates her recovery. She writes, "I dance, just as I promised before believing, all the way around the room." Earlier in the text, she describes the feminine Afro-Puerto Rican bomba dance form that shakes the ground beneath the feet of church and state. Dancing, then, rather than functioning as an antithesis to disability, is conveyed as an embodied sign of heritage, pleasure, and femininity. Without collapsing the important boundaries of individual disability experience, Levins-Morales once more extends her internal landscape outwards, bridging the gaps between medical, ecological, and community paradigms. Finally, in Drifting to Bottom, Levins-Morales borrows from the semantic field of ecology to read disability through the lens of sexual pleasure, which implicitly diversifies our understanding of how sexual pleasure and disability interact. She writes that she has sex as plants do, petals agape for pollen. She perceives herself as infinite earth, potent beyond all things and nearly motionless. She complicates notions of passive sex and challenges the problematic assumptions that a disabled body is either asexual or hypersexual, as Cassandra Lauser and colleagues have explored. Instead, she describes her aroused body in terms of a sea anemone. She is too exhausted to move, lickable, languid, sinking into the slick, soft mud. Phonetic intensives here confer a unified passion to the text, which underpins the entire passage's empowered, intermeshed sensuality. Arthur Frank has suggested that the ill body speaks eloquently in signs and symptoms, but Kindling reminds readers that pleasure is not excluded from the domain of bodily communication. In reality, the manifold interactions between disability and pleasure gesture to the irreducible complexities of embodiment in autopathography. Storytelling must be considered a vital force for any movement that wishes to analyse the various factors that produce, sustain, and alleviate illness. Kindling generates the kind of flexibility, synthesis, and overlap that make the autopathography genre so uniquely positioned for that task. Elizabeth Garcia has drawn attention to Levins-Morales' methodology of medicinal history that creates alternative historical narratives that are healing. The dominant strategy of this is to interrogate what might be considered naturalized ideologies, to give voice and agency to those silenced by entrenched power imbalances, and to query that which claims to be impartial and objective. Garcia cites Keith Jenkins, who posits that this is crucial to rewriting historical truths and acknowledging that history is a written discourse as liable to deconstruction as any other. Garcia extends Jenkins' position to the field of dominant Western medical discourse, which insists on the primacy of objectivity forged by scientific empiricism. This provides an invaluable lens for reading Kindling. Levins-Morales' autopathography functions as a mode of inquiry that combines intimate experience with biological discourse, expert diagnoses, and research. But perhaps most significantly, Levins-Morales invites readers to join her in inventing what she calls a psychosocial genetic cardioendocrine storytelling practice, something that uses the shovel of memory and metaphor to dig around in the whole question of history and heredity. Her persuasive writing amplifies her creative critical voice, which in turn actively works against the silencing that she has faced. Mapping the point at which cultural and scientific domains converge, Levins-Morales concludes Kindling by shifting the register, adopting the rhetoric of a political manifesto. She urges readers to come with your triggers, your losses, your scars, into a space of healing that acknowledges that our history is in our bodies, knowledge bound into our bones, our trembling muscles, our labouring lungs. She writes, "Here we are fruitful, our stories flower, take wing, reproduce like wind-blown seeds. No surgeon's knife can cut the lines of spirit. Our family tree remains." And with that, she gives us an illness narrative that reaches beyond individual subjectivity to an endless terrain of coexisting relations. Healing becomes an expansive, unifying, eco-biosocial interaction. And at the final stretch, Kindling compels us to consider autopathography as a holistically restorative method. Thank you. Some references there too.
Thank you so much, Alice. That was wonderfully rich, and thank you for introducing me to that book that I didn't know about. It's absolutely it's beautiful. I love the way she uses language, and the way you talk about the way she uses language, especially to kind of challenge the medical discourse. So we've had an incredibly rich selection of papers. We've heard about heredity. We've heard about the aesthetics of being sick, of time, and how sickness can slow time down and encourage us to rethink our normative relationship with clock time, and with a whole range of social conventions, history, science, all the kind of discourses of power. We've heard about intimacy, and we've heard about different ways of writing. And before we come to questions, I think I'd just like to pick up on Christina's phrase, the art of being sick, and perhaps ask each of you if you could just quickly talk a little bit about the writing, kind of in a way a little bit like Alice has just done. So how does the language of your writers reinforce or undermine the kind of normative medical discourses that Alice was discussing? So for example, Katja, we can start with Katja. Do the women write using the normative medical discourses, or is their kind of collaborative, intimate writing a way of undermining that?
Yes, I think that's an interesting question. Thinking about the way they write, sort of affective aesthetics that I have described, I would think that this kind of writing mainly undermines the medical discourse, because it kind of brings the emotional baggage and the suffering on the one side, but also the community to the front, and there's very little talking about medical language or physician encounters. There's a little bit of a hybrid to some degree. They have little inserts where they describe what is ALS, or give some information at the back of both books actually about about the disease, but I think that's more sort of working both ways together and creating a bit of a hybrid language. But overall, I think the more effective language is foregrounded.
I was interested in what you said about Katja, about kind of especially on the social media presence and blogs of doctors and kind of professionals as well, and I wondered how they engaged with non-medical language.
I think it's not the main parts of the blogs are more like other patients or nurses or caretakers or family members that write there. So the physicians only take a very small part in it. It's more nurses or the caretakers that they have daily contact with. In particular, the one is Sandra Schadek, with a range of caretakers that write to her on the blog, and I think they sort of engage in a similar language as she does. They also bring, what I found interesting is that they also discuss sort of difficulties in the care relationship, that it's sometimes also hard to take care of her because of her mood swings or the work itself, and so there's a little bit of a dialogue going on there, which I find quite fruitful.
Thank you. That sounds, that's interesting. That it will be interesting to hear how they deconstruct the kind of image of the perfect passive patient, I suppose. But before we go to I just wanted to ask Sarah about the depiction of of Oscar. I wondered if you could say a bit about the language that's used to depict him. Is there anything like at all that redeems his depiction? I suppose that's my question.
The language that's used to depict him is quite, it's very othering. He's talked about as being like a beast. It's like very animalistic most of the time. There's only one moment really where the narrator seems to use sympathetic language about him at all. There's a moment where the narrator says that he feels, I think he must feel lonely or something like that. But most of the time it's very much like an external perspective on him, and very much like a not a sympathetic one.
I think Alice's author would probably argue that being described in animalistic terms is not necessarily a negative thing. What do you think, Alice?
Yeah, it's interesting because I've kind of thought about this a lot in terms of kind of the woman body and how it kind of relates to nature, or the kind of disabled body. And of course there have been many kind of issues with that, I guess. But I think what Levins-Morales tries to say is that we can actually reclaim that language, especially if you're talking about your own kind of experiences. And that kind of, that explanation or that kind of description through animal bodies or ecological bodies can really firstly kind of help you represent how you're feeling, but also kind of reach across and make a kind of political statement about how all bodies need to be supported in that way. But yeah, it was really interesting listening also to Christina, and when Christina was talking about the ugly apple tree, and just how frequently nature metaphors kind of crop up in illness language. And I think that's definitely something that needs to be explored further.
Yeah, thanks. I think was it Christina that was also, or maybe it wasn't, I can't remember which one of you, sorry, was talking about the kind of the traditional kind of fighting, militarized imagery, and how that is being kind of questioned as well. I thought that was interesting. Christina, did you want to come in? Did you have anything to add in terms of this discussion of language and kind of imagery?
So it's interesting, Alice's presentation about the environment, because in mindfulness medicine, she talks about Mother Earth a lot, because so the Plum Village tradition is a form of engaged Buddhism which stresses applying Buddhist teachings to social actions to relieve suffering. And one of the things that practitioners focus on is ecological justice. So there's a practice of meditation called touching the earth, where the practitioner lays prostrate on the ground 5 times to meditate on their connection to nature and to their past and ancestors. So that's kind of one of the ways that I suppose a form of transcorporeality, in the sense that through the physical connection between the person's body and the ground, they kind of it forms like a connection to her past as well. So when Dang Nam does this prostration to the earth, she talks about how this meditation allows her to kind of talk to her mother, who obviously died at a very young age, and she didn't have very good memories of her, because her mother, when she was working, would physically abuse her when she was young. So she talks about how this form of earth meditation allows her to talk to her mother and kind of forgive her mother and kind of heal both her own pain and her mother's pain, because obviously she was sexually abused by her uncle, but her mother also was experienced a lot of sexual abuse from her partner. So she kind of sees her mother in herself and see herself and her mother in earth. So there's a kind of the concept in the published tradition is called interbeing. So the idea of being interdependent with all things in all across time. So yeah, that's something to think about.
Definitely, yeah. You reminded me of the other thing I was thinking about, which was sexuality and the kind of the way that all of the narratives potentially either reinforce or challenge these kind of I think it was Alice was talking about the like either passive kind of asexual woman, disabled woman, or that kind of hypersexual disabled person. I thought that was a very interesting point of intersection between the 4 papers. I think I'm monopolizing things somewhat, so I'm going to invite questions from the floor, comments, thoughts.
Yeah, Hannah, I've had a question sent to me in the chat privately, so I'll just read it. This is from Frankie McPherson, and it's a question to Alice saying, "Thanks for an incredible presentation. Can you recommend any other contemporary women writers who approach their illnesses through the environment?" So I guess that follows on quite nicely some previous comments about nature.
Yes, thank you for your question. So yeah, I'm actually looking at a poet called Polly Atkin at the moment, and her wonderful poetry that deals with well, it's kind of nature poetry. It's very much rooted in the kind of aesthetic figurations of nature, but Polly lives with genetic hemochromatosis and Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. So there's loads of stuff there that is just really fascinating and just beautiful to read as well. But yeah, this is something that I want to explore further in maybe down the line in terms of like a PhD. So also if other people have recommendations, I'd love to hear them as well. Thanks.
Any other thoughts, comments, questions?
Yeah, I just had one that I've just put in the chat, but if anyone wants to go before me, please feel free. Oh, sorry, I can see. Ignore my one. Steve Wilson's got his hand up.
Thanks, Ben. Thanks. I don't know, can people hear me? It says that I'm on mute, but I don't think I am.
Yeah, I can hear you, Steve.
Thanks, Hannah. Fascinating session. I just wanted to ask Katya, you know, if this whole use of digital autopathography and the rise of the patient blogger has become something of a phenomenon, I suppose, in recent years. And I remember reading that there was a lot of controversy about it in the United States about 5 or 6 years ago, where somebody was tweeting about her experience of breast cancer, and somebody in the New York Times picked up on this and asked, you know, what are the limits of self-expression on the internet when relating these events in life, precisely because there was the ethical risk of speaking about the doctor-patient encounter and the breaching confidentiality and things like that. I was just wondering if Katya has come across any instances of writers who either do that, who either breach confidentiality or behave in unethical ways when publishing online, which is such an easy thing to do with no checks and balances, or conversely, if there's any hints in their writing that in fact they're very aware of this and that they're very conscious of the boundaries of self-expression on the internet.
Yes, thank you for that comment. That's a very interesting question to think about. I don't remember coming across any comments in the book about the question of privacy, but I think let me reframe that. I think I remember one of the authors talking about sort of the way that they would talk about other people, and so there's no naming of other people in the book outside, I think, of their family members, and it's always related to first name. So I think that was a conscious decision that Schadek made, and for Zacher, I think she took several steps before she started to write the Facebook page. So there were some discussions with her husband, and she first opened up to her children and then to her friends before she made that step of writing online about it. So I think in the back of their minds there were thoughts about how to address issues of privacies in their blog, and whether other people would be included in it involuntarily. Another another aspect that comes to my mind is the question of like giving scientific or medical advice on these blogs, and how that could cause ethical issues, since blogs will not be sort of censored. We read that the advice is something that's medically reasonable or not. There could be some potential for misuse.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Leah's got her hand up.
Hi, yeah, thank you for those questions. I think, for those presentations. They were really fascinating. And one thing that I was thinking while I was listening to them is that in different ways, they all are exploring areas that I think are underexplored at the moment in the medical humanities, especially in relation to the experience of desire and spiritual experience. So I was wondering if maybe Christina and Alice, if you feel it's relevant to your text as well, could talk about how you navigate and what tools you use to discuss spirituality in a way that is kind of critically rigorous but isn't theology, and are there any challenges that you've come across in trying to do that in your research?
Hi, thank you for the question. It's a great question. Yeah, I mean, it is very under-researched, and obviously, so I struggled a lot with it. But when I started researching, I was a bit struck about the fact why it was so under research, because I don't know if anyone's familiar with Anne Hunziker Hawkins' the illness, reconstructing illness. It's a classic in the medical humanities about illness life writing, and obviously she's one of the scholars who popularized the term pathography. And in her book, she actually obviously she talks about John Donne. And she compares illness narratives to religious conversion narratives, because the way that patient writers write about illness is very similar to the experiences that a person undergoes when they have a religious conversion experience, particularly when what she calls healthy-mindedness pathographies are written in the New Age about alternative medicine, and how the enthusiasm that these writers have for these alternative medicines, according to Hunziker Hawkins, is very similar to when an evangelical Christian talking about a religious conversion. So that's one of the things that I found really fascinating about. So one of the things that I look at in my research is the elements of transformation as a whole holistic and embodied experience. And I turn to William James's The Variety of Religious Experiences, where he describes a religious conversion experience as a radical and total change in the way that a person looks at the world. And this is inherently subjective experience that is difficult to put into language, and it might appear irrational to people observing from the outside. So that's kind of where I kind of go from. And I kind of, in my thesis, I decided to come up with my own term, which is I call it active healing, where instead of healing in the medical sense, where something that doctors do to you by, for example, when you've got an open wound, then it heals if you put a plaster over it to prevent infection, or like the presence of antibiotics. For me, active healing is a transformative experience in the sense that it transforms the whole body and mind together and changes the way you experience the world. For example, when I was talking about in the presentation, the way that meditation and mindfulness changes the way Dang kind of looks at beauty and experiences beauty. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, I think it does. And it's really interesting that you're coming up with your own kind of terms and frameworks for thinking this through.
Alice, did you want to come in? Because I think Leah thought that might be relevant to you as well.
Yeah, so thank you, Leah, for the question. I think in terms of kindling, I wouldn't say that there's a specific, I wouldn't approach it from a kind of theological perspective, but then I'm also kind of not trained in religious studies either. So the tools that I use to kind of look at her holistic ways or alternative ways of kind of viewing interconnectivity is definitely through literature and close reading. I find close reading is perhaps the best tool to kind of start with, because, you know, every single word is just an image loaded with so much information and inferences. So I think I haven't really come up against the kind of spiritual, I guess the difficulties in researching kindling from like a kind of religious perspective, but I think in general I really like the idea of active healing. I think that applies to kindling as well. So yeah, I think there's room to kind of explore that further. I hope that answers your question.
That's so interesting. Stephen's just put something in the chat about the kind of spiritual language in autopathography from a French context. So there's a reference in there for everyone. And there's a question for Christina about whether mindfulness has an effect on the social world, or whether it's focused on an individual's quest for awakening. So I guess about the intersections between public and private, which actually a lot of these papers have been dealing with.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. I would say that in Buddhism, they don't really distinguish between public and private, in the sense that, like I was saying before, the idea of interbeing, where all things and all beings are interdependent and connected in the universe anyway. So one of the common criticisms of mindfulness from the social sciences in particular, and psychology also, is that mindfulness makes people solipsistic and selfish and self-centered. But in the Buddhist context, actually mindfulness, by becoming more aware of yourself and how your own actions, your own thoughts, and how you behave towards other people, that has an impact on the social world as well. And also by training kind of your empathy and your kind of sensitivity towards other people, it kind of it has a, I would say, ripple effects. I don't know if you have many friends who are meditators, anyone. If you interact with someone who is mindful in their action, you kind of absorb their kind of the habits and the manner of talking and behaving as well. So in a sense, by the I would suppose the principle in Buddhist ethical cultivation is that to change the world, you need to set yourself as kind of the starting point, and that's what a lot of the practitioners, when they have activists on their retreat, say to them is that you, although you are working to change the world for better in terms of activism, it's also important to take care of yourself and your body and mind, so that you can have that energy to kind of put into social action. So I suppose there's kind of not so much a strict divide between the public and the private, but seeing the public and the private as both interconnected and the same.
It's a really good answer. This actually connects a little bit to Ben's question. Ben, do you want to, it's kind of complicated and I know you've put it in the chat, but do you want to kind of like read it out?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, just thanks so much to everyone, honestly. I thought that was absolutely brilliant tonight. I've learned so much. I just had a question for Katya. I'll read it out now. So I was interested in what you were referring to as intimate public sphere, the concept of Lauren Berlant, I think, that you were talking about. In your presentation, technology seems to facilitate this intimate public sphere, such as Facebook and other forms of social media. Looking to the future, how can technology improve on this? What more could technology do in order to facilitate this intimate public sphere, or to create different types of intimate public spheres? And secondly, how could these public spheres be encouraged or in clinical settings, such as hospitals? How could hospitals support or host these technologies? Or are these technologies and spheres necessarily kind of outside of the clinic or extra clinical?
Yeah, thank you. These are excellent questions. Yeah, I can come back maybe to the concept of intimate public sphere first, as it used by Lauren Berlant. She has this sort of ambivalent thinking about it. I was trying to relate to in my talk, that on the one side, this there's a certain assumption of shared emotions and worldviews that is created through this kind of sphere that is very much linked to sort of home and family and American dream. And at the same time, there's a hope that through affective ties, through this conventionality, actually there's also some sort of counter space created where strangers form affective ties, and there's a certain political dynamic involved in it. I then related this concept, or I went to, I looked through it through the text of McCosker that's about cancer blogs, and he also uses this this term of intimate public sphere, or public intimacy, networked public intimacy, and sort of connects Berlant's term with technology, with cancer blogs. Yeah, and so as a way to to facilitate connections between strangers, I guess that's sort of the point, or the ability I see in the blogs and websites of the two projects I presented, that the blogs allowed to form connections between people that would have never met otherwise. Both, I think, both writers say that they were talking to people suddenly that they had forgotten for some time, or even strangers came up to them and talked about intimate things that which might have been more difficult to do in a sort of face-to-face encounter. Yeah, so how could that be improved? That's an interesting question. I honestly haven't thought about how that could even be facilitated, but it seems a very pertinent question given the current times, where we rely more and more on technology and for communication in times of pandemic. So yeah, there's certainly a big field for technology to even facilitate this this kind of interaction. And this, I'm maybe moving to the second question. I don't have a good answer to the first one, but I agree that there's that it's an important field of study. And the second question about the hospital environment, how this could be encouraged, is it's a question that's very close to my sort of daily life that I'm having in the hospital in a psychotherapy day clinic, where I think lots of these exchanges, interactions, support is taking place, where there's a group of patients coming together in every day, often in a therapeutic group setting to support each other. And so I think there's, like, at least in some areas of medicine, this sort of intimate sphere is created in some ways, but I think it's like a marginal area in the medical field where this takes place. I don't think that that's happening in many other areas. So there, I would certainly think that that this could be improved, and even we at the moment, I always hear patients talking about how they can connect with each other beyond their stay in the hospital, how they can keep in touch, and how they can continue this community that they appreciated. And it's often hard for them to go back home and to sort of end these connections. So it's something that's really close to my daily work to facilitate these kinds of interactions and exchanges among patients in the hospital, and then also beyond, because the patients need to create their social life outside of the hospital. Yeah.
Thanks so much. Just to quickly follow up on that, I was just wondering, in your experience as a physician and as a clinician yourself, do patients tell you that they're participating in online blogs or these type of spheres, and do you you've talked about this a bit in your presentation anyway, but do you read patient blogs, and do you, as a clinician, find it useful to know if your patients are participating in this kind of thing?
Yeah. Yeah, unfortunately, I haven't encountered any patient who has been talking about writing blogs. But writing about illness is certainly sort of part of the theory process, and but I haven't really encouraged patients to sort of publish what they are writing during therapy, what kind of notes they're making. I would feel like that's sort of imposing, like it's sort of their decision how much they want to publish. So unfortunately, I haven't encountered patients writing their own blog in that way. But what I do sometimes is to suggest other patients writing other memoirs for my patients. So I have sort of sometimes literature recommendation for them if I feel like that's something they would like to do, and that has been very well received.
Brilliant, thanks so much.
That's fascinating, isn't it? I really like this idea of like breaking down the boundaries so that practitioners recommend memoirs and blogs, and patients also recommend things to practitioners. Ben, has anyone else got their hand up? Because I can see the chat, but I can't see any hands.
I can't see anyone with their hand up at the moment. I know. No, I don't think so. If no. No. Okay. Well, I mean, do you think we've worked these guys hard enough? Should we let everyone go and get some food? I mean, it's been absolutely fascinating. I've got like about 6 more questions, but I also feel like we've been working really hard here. It was certainly a highlight of my week, I have to say. You have no idea how much time I spend doing really boring things compared to this. So I just wanted to thank everyone, all the 4 speakers, absolutely fascinating. I can't really get over the amount of really brilliant work that's happening amongst young scholars in this area, and it bodes so well for the future of the discipline and for academia. I think that we're getting all these really engaged kind of discussions. So thank you, and thank you, Ben and Becky, for inviting me. And I'll try and keep coming to the seminars, because I've learned really a lot. So thank you everyone.
And thank you, Hannah, for being here today and for moderating so well and asking your own questions and really weaving the material and the papers together so well. And also, like, opening just on a practical note, kind of you and Christina actually have been helping us a lot this week with kind of trying to like make our seminars more accessible. So we really appreciate your input this week. So if it's okay with everyone, well, to sum up, I'm just gonna introduce the theme for the next seminar in a fortnight's time, and I'll do that super quick so we can all go off and eat dinner, and then I'll also ping in the chat the link to register. So our next and final seminar of the year, because we've all got to celebrate Christmas. Keep seminars going. Anyway, no, it's on Tuesday the 15th of December, 5:30 to 7 UK time, as per usual. The theme for that week is chronic illness and pain, and we have 4 papers again. So we have Lise. Okay, Lise, I know you're here, and I googled how to pronounce the O with the dash through, so I think I'm going to try and do this. Lise Grunwald. And I also just kicked over some boxes. There we go. So Lise Grunwald will be presenting a paper entitled "Lists, Self-Accountancy and the Good Patient in Contemporary American Chronic Illness Memoirs." Then we have a paper by Hannah Clarkson entitled "Where Does It Hurt? Writing the Ailing Body." Third paper, Mariana Thomas will be presenting a paper called "The Affective Language of Pain and the Female Body, Illness in Contemporary Women's Writing." And then finally, the 4th paper, Anna Razakat will be presenting a paper called "Bridging the Gap Between Medical Science Writing and Female Experience" in Jessie Greengrass's site. So another kind of like whopper seminar on the 15th. if everyone can register via the IMLR link, and I'll put it in the chat, or it will also be on Twitter, and we'll be sending out information via the IMLR about it. Yeah, and that's about it. So yeah, thank you again to everyone, to our speakers, Alice, Christina, Katya, and Sarah for joining, and for Hannah for moderating. It's been really fantastic. So yeah, thank you again.